The Kate Dalley Show starts now.
Hi there. Welcome back to the Kate Dalley Show. We've got an exciting hour for you ahead. So I've got to introduce our next guest because he's amazing. We've had him on the show before, and he always makes me think, and I like that. This is Brandon Turbeville. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, Kate. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah,
hey,
absolutely.
Dave.
Absolutely. You know, you're the host of Truth on the Tracks. I love that. Truth on the Tracks. And it's a weekly news roundup that sort of serves as a hub for activists and information and solutions. I think it's great. And where can they find that, by the way, before we start talking to you?
They can find that at ucy.tv every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Nice. Okay, so tell us your background just a little bit, Brandon, and what because you have written 6 books. I think you just wrote the 7th, right?
Right. I just wrote a 7th book.
Wow.
A couple of the books, one of them is actually about the topic that we're going to discuss tonight. It's about the Syrian situation. It's called The Road to Damascus, the Anglo-American Assault on Syria. And it really brings you up from the beginning of the Syrian crisis and gives you a good background about how this started, who's behind it, and why.
Brandon, you're a regular sort of American guy, and where did you get your knowledge? Where did you get your drive and your instincts and your resource? Where did that come from for you to look into the Middle East and have that presence and understand what's going on over there?
Well, you know, the Syrian situation started heating up at about the time that the Libyan situation was reaching a crescendo. When they murdered Gaddafi, I was going to give a lecture on 9/11, and I saw the murder of Gaddafi on television, and that had a profound effect. And then you started to pay attention to Syria, and eventually, you know, you do enough research on this stuff, and now I've got a number of sources and contacts in Syria itself, so I can get a lot of information from directly on the ground, which is where I can get a lot of this intel.
Right.
One of the reasons I really wanted you on this show, Brandon, is because there's probably nobody that has looked into the Syrian conflict in history or present time than you. You're quoted, from Zaid Fidel to everywhere.
You're
on
everywhere.
all different sites.
Yeah.
You're pretty much the authority on what's going on over there.
Well, I appreciate it, and as I said, I try to keep up with it as much as possible. And this has been going on for at least 4 years now, and it goes back. The plan to destabilize Syria goes back much further than that. We know it goes back to at least 2005, 2006, and that's documents coming from the State Department that were released from the State Department through WikiLeaks. They didn't intentionally release it, but it was released to the State Department, and we know that this was a plan that was set up for a long time, and this is not really a new method of doing it. The destabilization and color revolution method has been used many times over in the past.
You know, we had a guest on previous that worked for the World Bank, and she had talked about that nuke pointed towards South Carolina, sort of that threat that if we didn't go to war in Syria years ago, that would be unleashed. Do you have a take on that? I'm just so curious. Do you have a take on that?
Well, I don't know of a nuke that's pointed at South Carolina. I know that Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, for which I apologize to the world. I had nothing to do with it. I tried to stop it, but it just keeps getting in, despite the fact that we all hate. And,
well, you have Graham, we have Hatch, and then Nevada has Reed. I mean, what can I tell you? I mean, I don't know how they do it, but anyway.
Yeah, I guess we shouldn't start a contest here.
Yeah.
Lindsey Graham is, you could sum up his whole campaign in one word, and that's war. And, I don't believe for a second he released any information to protect anybody. The guy's a lunatic. And I think this was mainly a threat that if we didn't go and invade Syria or bomb Iran or bomb whoever else is on his list, then the scary Muslims would come over and blow up Charleston Harbor with a nuke. Now, I will say that discussion is part of a larger discussion that's taking place all throughout the media, all throughout the government, all throughout society in general, and particularly in the media, where we're discussing the possibility of nuclear weapons being detonated in major cities in the United States, and that is quite scary, because we've got people like Dick Cheney saying, what if a terrorist gets a nuclear weapon and puts it on a flatbed truck and drives it outside the Beltway and blows it up there? And that's pretty specific there, Dick. What are you trying to allude to here. And a lot of this is predictive programming. You can see this in a number of television shows and movies where terrorists blow up nuclear weapons in major cities in the United States and Europe. And then there's, of course, martial law and nuclear war and so forth. So you got to wonder if this is not some type of predictive programming. We saw this before 9/11 with the idea of planes being flown into buildings, and of course, they had no idea when it actually happened that it was possible. But shows like the Lone Gunman, before 9/11, and then now we have shows. We had Jericho several years ago. We've got a number of movies in recent years where weapons are being detonated in major cities. And again, people like Dick Cheney and Lindsey Graham and a couple of others have been mentioning this. So I worry, in some respect, that this is not some type of
conditioning.
For a false flag attack that will be used to eliminate any vestige of civil liberties or civil rights, and just go ahead and march on to war.
I actually agree with you, because we had some people in the beginning of the show, and they wonder if I think Iran will do that. I actually fear our country doing that more, just like they were going to do with the Northwoods document in Cuba. That's a great example because it's a written document that you can actually go look at. So as far as proof goes that we're willing to do anything to go to war, that worries me. I don't worry so much about Iran popping off a nuke as us being behind something where we're blaming it on somebody else.
Yeah, as for the Iran situation, I would tell anybody who's worried about Iran detonating a nuclear weapon anywhere, they have to get one first, and they don't have one. And the intelligence analysis that's come out, even from Israel, and they try to promote war with any of their Middle Eastern neighbors, because they know that, they're willing to fight and die to the last American, like a lot of other people, whenever they start wars in the Middle East. So they want to go after Iran, and even their intelligence agencies have admitted that there's no program to develop a nuclear weapon from Iran. Our intelligence agencies have said that as well. So there's no program to start a nuclear weapon. Nuclear capability is different from having nuclear weapons, right? It's different. A lot of countries have the ability to develop or to begin developing a nuclear weapon, and we're not threatening them. The Saudi Arabians have announced that they want a nuclear weapon at one point. The Turks are now considering it, and I don't see any major concern about these countries, right?
They're Arab.
And people are scared to death about Iran. What happened in 2003? We got told that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and here we are, just 12 years later, and you're going to fall for it again? We're not even out of the first one yet. So you're going to... it at least took us a while after Vietnam to get back into Iraq. Now we just do it again in a little over 10 years. This is all propaganda. Iran has every right to do what it was doing before this nuclear deal. I only support the nuclear deal in the sense that it's war avoidance, but really Iran never should have had to sign any deal with the United States to begin with, because they were well within their rights internationally to do every single thing that they were doing, and it's really an insult to say that they had to sign the deal. But I think people should really go back and research what's really happening.
Why are we giving them all of the money too, though? Why are we doing that? Why is that part of the deal?
Their money, isn't it?
That's what I've heard. So I just wanted to get your take, Brandon.
Giving them the money?
The 150, is it million, billion? I don't know. I lose track. But the money that's attached to that deal, too, that we'll be handing them.
I'm not really sure about handing them money. That's really chicken feed, considering what they've given other places and what they spend on, different areas and terrorists in Syria. So that's not really a huge deal. It's probably something that the Iranians attached on there for some type of symbolic gesture.
Well, that was currency that I think belonged to them in the first place, that we seized their assets, and now we're releasing it. So it's not really given; it's just allowing them to have what they had.
The assets, that's I didn't know anything about giving them money, but the assets are going to be released as the sanctions move off, and that's the biggest. That's the biggest issue. As Dave said, that belongs to them anyways, just being unfrozen as the sanctions are removed.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of get to the current events, what's going on right now. Do you think that did the Russians pull the rug out from underneath us in Syria?
Well, you want to say that Putin's playing chess and Obama's playing checkers at this point, but, there's always, I don't think the United States has given up or NATO has given up on Syria yet. This is, the chess pieces have been moved, but there's always the next turn for someone else. What you can see, though, with the Russian involvement in Syria, that was one major chess play. It was quite impressive. If you look at the speech that Putin gave in front of the United Nations, if we've ever had a president go to the United Nations and look like a clown, we have had that happen this time. Because if you look at the speech that Obama gave versus the one that Putin gave, and you can get English translations, accurate English translations, and not sound bites on the internet. You can find them. Putin has obviously called out the United States for supporting terrorism in Syria and other places, and for essentially acting like a rogue nation. The Russian response in Syria, of course, is it's entirely legal under international law. Remember, the United States is involved in a bombing campaign in Syria. It's illegal. The Syrians did not invite them in, so it's not legal under international law. The Syrians did invite the Russians in, so it is legal under international law. And so now we can add, there are 4 parties fighting ISIS in Syria. That's the Syrian government, that's Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. And that's really it. Everybody else has been protecting ISIS. And the anti-ISIS coalition is acting as the ISIS Air Force. Whether or not the United States is going to respond in a number of different ways is really anybody's guess. You can only guess how this is going to work out. What is most concerning, though, is that now we have Russian planes flying over Syria dropping bombs. We've got French planes. We've got United States planes, of course, and we've got Israeli planes, and they're always the wild card. And we have this situation where one pilot could really have the fate of the world in his hands, because if the Americans decide that they are going to shoot down a Russian jet and call the Russians bluff, what's going to happen?
Right.
What if the Israelis, who are always willing to do something like that, what if they shoot down a Russian jet? Is there going to be a response, or vice versa? What if the Russians are going in for a bombing run and then they see an American jet approaching them in an aggressive manner and they fire in self-defense? What if they do that to the Israelis? And again, today we had sort of a potential clash situation between the Russians and the Israelis a number of hours ago, where the Russians ran into, they didn't run into it physically, but they came upon Israeli jets that were flying outside off the Mediterranean coast where they had no business. And there was this situation where there was a brief standoff, and of course nothing happened. But this illustrates the potential here. And that's just the air question, right? We've also got Russian troops on the ground in the base at Latakia, and of course at Tartus, and we've got Russian special forces. Russia will deny that, but there are Russian special forces on the ground in Syria, and we've got American special forces on the ground in Syria, and they've been there since the beginning of the conflict. So this is no longer proxy situations. This is a potential for direct military conflict between 2 nuclear powers, and that's a very scary situation.
Jeez.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
It is, and now I understand the Chinese are starting to move in. Putin has drafted 150,000 Chechens who are eager to go fight the ISIS because they misrepresent Islam, and he might bring in some troops from Belarus.
Is our in saying in the media, and it was all over the media, where we were just trying to get on top of this situation. It was just so funny. The headlines were so funny, and all of it was about lies. Russia must be lying. And if they annihilate the boogeyman ISIS, then what do we have for the terror, right? Then does Russia, if they annihilate that boogeyman, does now Russia become the biggest boogeyman we've ever had, and ISIS is sort of, you know what I mean? Are we worried about that?
Enemy.
Are we worried? Yeah. Are we worried about them annihilating our enemy before we want them to?
Yeah. Well, I think what's funny here, one aspect of it is you can see who supports ISIS by the reaction to the Russian bombing, right? It's had to be very nuanced, but the response is, oh my God, the Russians are involved in Syria, they're going to ruin everything. Well, they're bombing ISIS, so what's the problem, right? Why are you so upset if they're bombing ISIS? In fact, in the last 48 hours, they've done more than the United States has done since they began their coalition, right, a year and a half. Just by not helping ISIS, that would have been more than the U.S. has done over the last several months. So that's one issue. And, of course, I think you're right. They have been building up Russia to be the big enemy for quite some time, especially over the situation in Ukraine. And now the situation in Syria. But if you look at Zbigniew Brzezinski's grand chessboard, he mentions that Russia is one of the countries that's going to have to be broken up into three parts. They have this sort of Western Europe version of Russia, then the Central Russia, and then Eurasian Russia, and be eventually brought into sort of the pan European Union. And that is what we're seeing now with the United States encircling, not just the United States, NATO is encircling Russia on the ground, not only in Europe and Asia, but as you see what's happening in the Middle East with Russia's influence being whittled away, they're being encircled, and obviously Russia's not going to allow itself to be broken up into three parts willingly. No one would.
No one would. In my mind's eye, I could just picture that command center in Baghdad when that Russian general walks in and says, "We're going to be bombing in 1 hour," and everybody's surprised. I suppose they all jumped on their cell phones and called their ISIS commander saying, "Get out, get out. You're going to get hit." Because apparently their first strikes were command centers, ammunition dumps, all the logistics areas. So it's, Yeah, notice though, the media is saying, "Oh, look, the Russians came in and just barked orders at us and said that if you don't get out of the air, there could be danger. We're just going to bomb in an hour." They didn't complain when the Turks did that. The Turks went in and essentially went to a U.S. military base and told them that they were going to be bombing in a matter of minutes, and they had to scatter their military personnel because they were in the general area where the Turks were going to be bombing, and it was pretty clear that if they didn't get out, the Turks might hit them. Nobody complained about that. And, of course, what the Turks did was they bombed the Kurds, and the Kurds were the major fighting force, at least in Syria, against ISIS. They had almost shut off that border with Turkey. The Kurds on the ground there have gotten this long border between Syria and Turkey. They've gotten the eastern half and the western half largely closed off. There's about a 60-mile portion in the middle that the Kurds had yet to seal off. And they were on their way to doing that until the United States and Turkey stepped in and said, we're going to have an ISIL-free zone, which is essentially a no-fly zone, and any parties to the conflict, they're going to be bombed. And it just so happens to be in that 60-mile zone that the Kurds hadn't sealed off yet. And what that does, immediately when that was declared, ISIS, quote unquote, ran into the area and set up shop, because this is the last little area where the ISIS fighters can come through Turkey and ship arms and ship personnel into Syria. If the United States wanted to stop terrorism, if Turkey wanted to stop terrorism, it's extremely simple. All you have to do is close that 60-mile portion of the border off, and it's done. The terrorists are going to wither on the vine. You can let Assad and Russia take care of the rest, and they would. The big problem here is that they have this lifeline, this artery of weaponry and material that they're not that's not been cut off. Once that gets cut off, ISIS is not the Superman brigade that the media proclaims that it is. Right? This is a group of savages and nitwits that are backed up by a few double agents and some special operatives.
We have a caller for you, but go ahead and finish your sentence.
Well, only because we continue to feed them information and intelligence and material and personnel are they able to do what they're doing.
Gotcha. Okay, here's the caller. Hi, caller. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Excellent topic. Great guest.
Thank you.
Yeah, just wondering a little bit about his history about why we went into the war with Iraq. I'm sure he realizes that at the time there was a majority opinions, both publicly and politically, to invade Iraq, not not only just because of the response to 9/11, because of the massive concern about Saddam Hussein and disposing him. It's rarely talked about, but wouldn't the guest at the very least admit that we had motivation to depose a dictator who was responsible for killing thousands of his own people?
Excellent question. You want to take that, Brandon?
I would not admit that at all. I'm getting an echo here,
okay,
guys.
Hold on. Here we go.
Go ahead.
All right. Thanks, caller. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I would not admit that we were motivated by a dictator killing his own people at all, simply because we didn't mind him killing his own people, allegedly, when we were promoting him to go in and start a war with Iran. We didn't mind him gassing the Kurds, which we gave him gas to do, and we didn't mind killing Iraqis ourselves when we went into Iraq to begin with, and then imposed sanctions and killed about 1 million of them. So we actually said that cost was worth it. Saddam Hussein, not a great guy, dictator, yeah, sure, but much worse under the Americans, got much worse. And, yeah, they were not interested at all in deposing a dictator. What they were interested in was beginning the march across the Middle East, which was spelled out in the document Rebuilding America's Defenses, written by the Project for a New American Century, which labeled a number of countries that they wanted to destroy, including one of them was Iraq, of course. Then it was Libya, Syria, Lebanon, and Iran. And we have marched right in line with that document. It was written in the late 90s before 9/11, and you can see that we're going on that roadmap today.
Seems like we're always using that excuse, that Emmanuel Goldstein, that we've all got to hate and invade, whether it's Saddam Hussein or now it's Bashar Assad, or, it doesn't matter who it was, in Libya and Iraq. It's always, we've got to get rid of that evil dictator. And that kind of gives us a moral high ground.
We pick and choose who they are at the time. I mean,
yes.
We have ones right now that we're not going after. So where's the incentive? I mean, what are the actual incentives, right?
Yeah, the incentives, of course, were also oil and geopolitical positioning, major bases in the Middle East for an attack on Iran and Syria. It put us right in the middle of the Middle East to do that.
But if we don't make it moral, we can't sell it to the American people. They won't get behind it unless we think people are at stake. We've got to go in and rescue. If that's not the case, we're not behind the war.
Yeah, and also, I mean, what is this idea that the United States can determine that someone's killing their own people and then start a war over it and kill more people? This is ridiculous. And if you're worried about that, why not go to your friends, the Saudis, right, who have chop square and don't mind beheading people for witchcraft,
right,
and crucifying kids.
Crucifying teenagers, yeah. So why don't we go after the Saudis? Because nobody's concerned about human rights. The United States hasn't been concerned with human rights for a long time. And, of course, we had death squads in South America during the 80s, and we've got death squads in the Middle East today. So no motivation there in terms of human rights.
Yeah, and I'll agree with you, because we have a lot of callers, not a lot, a few callers that will call in and say, I won't believe, I just will refuse to believe that my government's capable of that. We just don't understand how much is at stake here, do we, Brandon? And we're talking with Brandon Turbeville, by the way. Truth on the Tracks is his radio show, and you can catch that online too. But I'm telling you, I don't think we grasp what's at stake, because we're sold on the moral war so many times over that we don't realize what they're really going after and how big and powerful that really is. I mean, I'm sure when you started really getting into this and studying this, you started to realize what's at stake. And then you kind of understand why they're willing to compensate lives, and they don't really matter who they are, right? Yeah,
the average person's life means nothing to the individuals running these types of wars. It's not even really a calculation in terms of civilian lives. Again, remember Madeleine Albright said that the 1 million dead Iraqis was absolutely a price that was worth paying just to impose sanctions on Saddam Hussein.
Let me take the caller. Hold on just a moment. Hi, caller. Do you have a question for Brandon Turbeville?
Yeah, no, it's a great program today.
Thanks.
My thing is, I agree with what you're saying. I tell people, we just got to get out of all this Middle Eastern stuff. We're trying to police the world, and they say, well, that's a libertarian line, and that's weak on defense, and there's American interests at stake. I mean, what's your reply to this? It's like this regurgitation of the same justifying all this stuff.
Thank you. I'll have him do that off the air. Go right ahead, Brandon.
Well, I hope the people who are upset that, you don't want to become the policeman of the world, I hope that they're in the process of suiting up and then traveling to these countries to be on the front lines of the combat. Otherwise, I'm really not interested in what they have to say.
Right.
Because they're always ready to push someone else into a war, send somebody else's kids to war while they sit on the couch and watch football and feel tough because somebody else is fighting. I have absolutely no respect for that, and I toss that out of the window.
I actually have a question about that, because I had a caller one time that said, "No, we're spreading democracy. That's what we're doing in every conflict we go in."
We get those calls.
We do. That's why they're there. They're spreading democracy, and I almost had no words. It was like, really? Do you really think that? So, what would your response be to that?
We should try it here at home first. I mean, what democracy? What kind of democracy is this? Why don't you go to Iraq and look at the democracy that they've got? If it's so great, why don't you go to Libya? Why don't you go to Syria? Anywhere that we have been and spread democracy, it's absolute hell.
It's chaotic.
It's chaos. It's beheadings. It's rape. It's savagery. If that's democracy, I don't want any of it. Please keep it away from me. It's horrible.
Yeah, now, how do you separate that, Brandon, from I'm not going to say love of country, but you live in the United States. I would imagine that you like living here, and that's why you do. So how do you separate that? Because I think that's what's hard for people to separate. How do I love my country but understand what they're doing?
Well, that really is part of loving your country, right? Is to understand what's happening and not being happy when a group or an oligarchy has taken over and used things like the military or used the mechanisms that we have in place for ill-gotten gains. And of course, regardless, I'm not one of those people who say my country right or wrong. By the way, when you're killing innocent people, I'm gonna oppose that, and that's what we've been doing. The United States military should be used for one purpose. And it's not spreading democracy. It's not helping our allies and friends across the world. And it's not for protecting this vague thing known as national interest. It's for self-defense.
Right.
And I think, the fact that the United States military hasn't been used for self-defense in any, recent history is telling. But it's been all across the world in all kinds of different conflicts. And I think, that's what I would say to that. The Japan, for instance, had just passed laws. It had a constitutional amendment that said the military couldn't be used for imperialist purposes, essentially. And they removed it. And now they can use their military for imperialist purposes. It was the only country, to my knowledge, that had such a constitutional amendment, and they all should have a constitutional amendment that says the military can't be used for imperialist purposes.
I agree.
That's not the purpose and reason that you have a military is for self-defense. And
I agree with that. I do agree with that. And when you read the PNAC that came out before 9/11 and called for the war in Iraq, of course, but it talked about our preeminence. We're so interested in safeguarding our preeminence around the world.
By the way, there's a geopolitical reason for that Japanese change of heart too.
Ooh,
absolutely.
All right, we'll come right back. Will you stay with us, Brandon?
Sure will.
Okay. We'll be right back. More with Brandon Turbeville when we come back. His show is called Truth on the Tracks. You need to catch his show. He knows what he's talking about. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Hi, it's Elise from the Travel.
Best mattress. You deserve it.
Smart, caring for you and about you.
Talk lines are open now. Call 888-673-1450. This is the Kate Dalley Show.
You roll me back again, and you know I'll do anything. Just when I thought I was free. Knock, knock, the door is locked, but you still got a key.
Hi there. Welcome back to the Kate Dalley Show. Boy, we have a great guest on for this hour. We've got Brandon Turbeville. Hi, Brandon. How are you?
Hey, Kate.
Hi, and I've got Dave Dodridge in studio with me, and we're talking Syria, and we're talking Russia, and I know everybody's concerned about this. And, what we're being told in the American press is that Russia is lying to us. It's not the reason they're there. And we've talked about this a little bit already, but they're not after ISIS. And so what is the story? What are we being told here? What are they actually doing then? What do we think they're actually doing? Or what are we trying to sell to the American people that they're actually doing over there?
Well, the mainstream media is saying, they're just trying to prop up the government of Assad. Well, that's true enough. They are trying to prop up the government of Assad, and that's good. I support that. They should be doing that. We should be doing that. The other issue is that they're trying to say that the Russians, well, they're not after ISIS, not just after ISIS. They're bombing the moderate rebels too. Mm-hmm. And well, that's true enough in the sense that they're bombing people that the United States presents as being moderate rebels, right? But of course, the idea that there's such a thing as a moderate rebel in Syria is false. There never were moderate rebels in Syria. It was violent from the word go, and
it's like a jumbo shrimp. It's an oxymoron. It's ridiculous.
It's interesting that the Russians are not bombing the Free Syrian Army.
Yeah.
They declared them a legitimate political adversary.
Right.
So
yeah, and I think that's a mistake. But the Free Syrian Army is as much of a terrorist group as ISIS. Remember, you remember Abu Sakar, the heart eater?
Mm-hmm.
The guy, the heart of the Syrian soldier and ate it. Yeah, he was a member of the Yarmouk Brigade, which is a brigade under the Free Syrian Army. So you can see how moderate the Free Syrian Army is. Even Basel Idris was one of the commanders of the Free Syrian Army who admitted that they worked with ISIS. So I would recommend that Russia bomb them too.
Okay.
But there's no moderate rebel in Syria. I think we discussed this before on your show. The idea that you can call them ISIS, you can call them whatever you want, but these guys are all the same.
Mm-hmm. And no, go ahead.
It was Al Qaeda in Iraq, and in Syria it was Nusra. Then it became the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant, and then it became ISIL, and then it became ISIS. It's the same stuff, and they all work together. The Nusra is working with Haraka Azam, who was supposed to be a moderate rebel organization that works with ISIS regularly, that gets weapons, says they're moderate, gets weapons, and then they go over to ISIS and hand them over and join forces with ISIS. And the United States knows this. It's a conduit force. There's all these little brigades with different names and silly monikers and stuff like that, but they're all under the same overarching command and control structure. And sometimes they fight, but they're savages. That's what happens.
I have 3 questions for you. One was the uranium find by Iran. The second one was, Russia says they're going in to protect naval bases, but then we say we have some there. What's the deal with that? And then also the refugees. I wanted you to hit on that. I wanted to get your perspective on the refugees. Because Congress was just talking about taking over 200,000 of them into the United States. So I'd love your take on all 3 of those things.
Well, the Russian question, let me just mention one other thing. If we're talking about lies in regards to the Russian situation, the Americans the Western media immediately came out and said, look, Russia bombed in Syria and they killed civilians.
Yes, they hadn't even done anything yet, right?
The planes had not taken off of the airport yet, and we said they killed civilians. Then there was this group called the White Helmets. This is an NGO, and anytime you hear an international NGO, you should run like crazy. This thing is connected to George Soros, and you should get in the car and hit the gas.
About him.
Hear that? Yeah. So this group puts out a picture of the Syria Civil Defense Force, another NGO, holding a little girl who's bleeding, and this is heartbreaking picture, and they say this is what the Russians have done in Syria. The only problem was the picture was taken 5 days ago, so. Sorry, not a relevant picture. This was something else. And this was paraded on the mainstream as look what Russia has done. And thankfully there are people who are actually paying attention who can notice these pictures when they come up. And this was proven false. So this is the kind of stuff that you get on the media in terms of what's going on there. Now, on the question of the refugees, that's going to be, that's somewhat of a more complicated issue, but one thing I'll say, the first part of this is the question of who is responsible for Syrians fleeing Syria. The Western media will say it's Assad for killing his own people. 250,000 people have been killed in Syria, and according to the Western media, they were all killed personally by Bashar al-Assad. None of the silly rebels or ISIS were responsible for any of that stuff. It was all because of Assad. Well, obviously that's not true, because when you see Syrian civilians fleeing areas where these moderate rebels come to spread democracy, they run to the government areas. And that's why there was such a pressure in places like Latakia from people who have come from the democracy of these rebels to go live in the safety and security of the Syrian government. Mm-hmm. And now Turkey had a policy of accepting Syrian refugees, and it was a very suspicious policy, because as we can see, Turkey doesn't care one iota for the Syrian people, considering the fact that it's sending in savages across the border to destroy the country, and the fact that they've been bombing Kurds and doing all that kind of stuff. So it was a little interesting and a little suspicious to a lot of people as to how they had taken in nearly 2 million Syrian people who were living in these tent cities. Well, the reason a lot of these Syrians were drowning was because the Turks would not allow them to go over the land route. They were forcing them to take the water route. And you can actually get to Europe from Turkey through land. You don't need to get on a boat, but yet they were getting pushed onto these rickety boats to go to Europe. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it. Now, also the question is, a lot of these Syrian people, and I'm speaking of Syrians here, and I'm making it clear that there are other people in this refugee mix. And I'll get to that in just a second. But the Syrian people, it might seem strange to a lot of people in Europe and the United States, but not everybody in the world wants to be here. And they would prefer to be in Syria and go home and stay at home, but we ruin that for them with bombing and with terrorism. And as for the responsibility of the situation in Syria, that lies fully on the shoulders of the United States, Britain, France, and NATO, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the GCC, and Israel. These are the people who are responsible for the situation in Syria. It was created by them, and they're responsible for the refugees there. Now, when you get to the question of should they be allowed into Europe, well, or the United States, that's another question, because Europe has had this open immigration policy for so long. They have absolutely destroyed Europe with immigration. The United States is doing that too, and I'm talking culturally. If you've been to England, for instance, you go to London, and go ahead, Dave.
I was there several years ago. There are no British people there.
No white British people.
The outskirts.
London. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of Arab people, Indian people, African people, and this is nothing against them as people, but this is England, right? This is London, and there's no white British people.
Only the bobbies.
Yeah, there's a few bobbies, but they're an extreme minority in London. And you go to other countries across Europe. France, for instance, has this issue with immigration to the point that there's all kinds of social tension. Tony Blair actually admitted that. He said that it was his job, or his secretary said it was their job to change the face of Britain and the culture of Britain forever, and they've done it. So you can't let hundreds of thousands of immigrants just pour into Europe. I'm sorry, you just can't do it. They've got enough immigration as it is. Europeans have as much right to their own culture and their own country as anybody else. And while it is the fault of NATO for the situation in Syria, it is not legitimate to say that the European people have to essentially subsume their culture and give it up for more immigration. They just can't handle this, and they should not accept any more refugees, and neither should we. The question is, the real response, if you're worried about the refugees, is stop terrorism, shut the border, help stop terrorism, and let them go home where they want to be.
Right.
Now, I also want to point out that a lot of the people who are coming into Europe are not Syrian, and you can see this from pictures, and you can see this from videos. And out of the people who are Syrian, by the way, I should mention this too. I've got sources in Syria, as I said before. A lot of the people who are getting priority to go to Europe are not the average Syrian person. These are people who are more fundamentalist in nature, right? These guys seem to be getting priority to go over to Europe. So you got to wonder why. Why are we bringing over people who seem to be selected because they have more fundamentalist views? And what's that going to mean when they get there? We were already seeing social tension whenever you bring in immigration like that, immigrants like that. You have a situation where you have people who become second-class citizens. They work for less. They become bitter because they get treated second-class and their wages are low and they're poor. The average person gets bitter because there's a clash of cultures. Their culture is being destroyed. And they're losing their jobs because wages are being driven down, or because the immigrants will work for less. There's social tension. And these people are being brought in, a lot of them from Africa. Remember, there's a lot of them coming from Eritrea. I think there were a lot coming from Nigeria, from Algeria, from a number of other countries, not even Syria. So if we're being told we have to open up the floodgates to immigration in Europe and the United States because of the situation in Syria, so let's bring all of the Africans in. And that doesn't make any logical sense. The only reason that people are really following along with this open immigration policy is because if you don't, you get called a racist. And, again, as I said, this open immigration policy has been a failure in Europe, and it's been a failure here. Europe is not a melting pot, and it shouldn't be. So the solution to this question is not thousands and thousands and thousands of immigrants pouring into Europe. It's stopping terrorism in Syria by allowing the Syrian government and the Russians, if that's the way it's going to be, let them handle the terrorism, right? Close the borders and let them handle the terrorists, stop supporting the terrorists. And you can actually have some type of, use the Federal Reserve with, it's got credit power. We gave credit stimulus to Wall Street, so we can use credit stimulus to go to Syria to rebuild and use, produce the machinery and equipment here and let them do that. So that's the solution. But
I have a question for you. As a military historian also, and I want to know how effective you think the Russian strategy is going to be. I've been following the war for 4 years now, and it seemed like the Syrian army, as they're building up, they're very effective at destroying pickup trucks with 23mm cannons on them. They're effective at clearing, blocks of neighborhoods here and there, and wherever they choose to fight. But they're never able to get at where the logistics and the headquarters. The Russians, it seems, have gone for the head. They've gone straight for the command and control centers. And do you think that this would cause do you think it's going to end soon? Is basically the bottom line. I don't know
whether or not it's going to end soon. I'm not really sure. But the reason for that is because the Russians have access to satellite intelligence that the Syrians don't. And for whatever reason, the Russians had not been providing the Syrians with satellite intelligence in the way that they really should have. And of course, the Syrian military has had an issue with personnel. It's had an issue with morale 4 years on, and they try to do these things in surgical ways to minimize the loss of life. But it's becoming too much with the flooding of terrorists coming across Turkey and that sort of things. It's hard to say how long this is going to continue. I mean, we should mention that it's not just the Russians who are involved here. We've got thousands of Iranian troops who are now in Syria, who are about ready to start launching full frontal assaults. Hezbollah is also involved. They're going to be fighting ISIS directly with Iran and the Syrian soldiers as well. And the Iraqis are now discussing sending troops into Syria as well to help cut them off from the other side. So
Did the deal with Iran, did anything have to do with setting them up for a false flag, setting them up for a situation where someone was going to get blamed for something between Israel and Iran? What's your take on that?
It very well could be. And, I think what we can see with the Iranian deal is that very soon, and this may not be, I don't mean, next week, but this could be within the next couple of years. I think you're going to see a lot of whining from the United States and particularly Israel that Iran has violated this one small minute detail. They didn't provide, the reports on blue construction paper on Wednesday, and therefore they're trying to get a nuclear weapon. And the Israelis, of course, have already discussed it publicly in the media. That's been something that's been discussed repeatedly in the Israeli media, is whether or not we should strike Iran now, or whether we should do it later, or whether we should provoke the United States into doing it. And I think that within the next few years, you're probably going to see some type of a situation in which Iran is provoked, or they claim that they're violating the agreement when they're not, or maybe there is some type of small, minute detail that didn't get, some T didn't get crossed or something, and then that's going to be the catalyst for some type of invasion or bombing.
Okay. We don't have a ton of time left. Did you have a final question, Dave?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. I do have some questions on the recent happenings there on those jets between Israel and Syria and stuff. But
do you have a quick take on that?
Well, I mean, just what I said earlier is that they were there, and the Israelis were there in the Eastern Mediterranean where they had no business to be, and the Russian jets came upon them, and there was this tense situation for a moment. The Israelis turned away, but that's all the information that I've got on it. Okay. That's a potentially catastrophic situation. It's potentially explosive if they literally. If they clash.
Brandon, it's been so fun. You got to come back soon.
Thank you so much.
I always love your take.
As things develop in the Middle East, we're gonna need you on.
What's your newest book, Brandon?
I've got a new book about Hillary Clinton. It's called The Difference It Makes, 36 Reasons Hillary Clinton Should Never Be President. You can buy it at my website, BrandonTurbeville.com. There's also an Amazon Kindle version for 99 cents, and it's free. If you go to my website, you can pull up the PDF, and I'm giving it away for free. So,
nice.
Wow.
So
I love that.
To be in the White House.
You're great. I love that. And believe me, that's going to be a good read, I'm sure. And then also Truth on the Tracks. Go ahead and Google that, check that out, and get to his site to be able to listen to him on Sunday nights. Sunday nights, right?
Monday nights.
Monday nights. Okay. Monday nights at 7 o'clock our time, 9 o'clock your time. Correct?
Right.
Okay. Brandon, thank you so much.
Brandon.
Appreciate you.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you.